A single painting sells for $42 million. Nobody in the auction room claps. Nobody even blinks. Pip is sitting in the back row of that auction hall, tiny legs swinging off the edge of a velvet chair. Pip's eyes go wide at the number flashing on the screen. Pip leans over to the person next to them. Nobody answers. Nobody in this room ever really answers questions like that. The buyer's name isn't announced. It never is. Pip pulls out that little magnifying glass and squints toward the phone bidder in the corner, the one whispering instructions to an auction house employee. No name, no face, just a paddle number and a nod. Somewhere, hundreds of miles from this auction house, there's a warehouse near an airport. Pip imagines it. Rows of crates. Climate control humming quietly in the dark. That same painting, the one that just sold for $42 million, will eventually end up inside one of those crates. Nobody will hang it on a wall. Nobody will ever really look at it again. Pip doesn't understand yet why anyone would spend that much money on something they'll never see. That confusion is the whole reason this story exists. Because the art world doesn't need to break a single law to move enormous piles of money in near total silence. It was built this way from the very beginning. No suspicious bank transfer required. No flagged wire. Just a canvas. A price nobody has to explain. And a buyer nobody has to name. Pip hops down from the velvet chair. Pip is about to follow this painting's money trail all the way down to where it starts. An artist. In a small studio. With absolutely no idea what she's about to become a part of.
Level 1. The artist who never sees the money move. Pip pushes open a creaky wooden door above a hardware store. Paint fumes. Stacked canvases leaning against every wall. A woman in the corner scrapes dried paint off her palette with a metal spatula. She's been painting here for 6 years. Pip sits quietly on a paint can, watching her work. A gallery owner finally agreed to represent her after 2 long years of polite rejection letters. Her first piece sells for $800. Pip claps both tiny hands together, genuinely thrilled for her. It's the first time in her life someone paid real money for something she made with her own hands. She has no idea what happens to that painting after it leaves this room. Pip doesn't either. Not yet. Most artists never do. The gallery takes 50% of the sale, standard across this entire industry. The rest is hers to keep. A year passes. Pip watches her studio slowly fill with better brushes, a proper easel, a small space heater for the cold months. Then the gallery calls again. A collector wants 3 more paintings, paying well above her usual asking price. Pip's eyes narrow slightly, the magnifying glass creeping halfway out of the pocket. She doesn't ask many questions. Why would she? An artist finally getting paid what she's worth doesn't feel like a red flag. It feels like a dream coming true. Pip floats up above the studio for a moment, looking down at the whole block like a tiny bird. Somewhere above this artist, invisible to her completely, sits an entire layer of the art world she will likely never interact with in her whole career. Art dealers, historically, have operated with very little obligation to ask who's really paying them, or where that money actually came from. A jewelry store selling a $10,000 necklace has had to ask harder questions for years than a gallery selling a $10,000 painting. Pip tilts its head at that. That gap, small as it sounds, is the seed of everything about to happen next. Her paintings start selling faster than she can paint them. She assumes it's talent, finally being recognized. Pip believes that too at first, and honestly, in part, it probably is real recognition. But somewhere above her, at a level neither of them can see from here, her rising prices are being watched closely. Not because anyone loves her brushstrokes, because a fast-rising, under-the-radar artist is exactly what a very different kind of buyer is looking for. Pip shivers slightly, the way you do when you sense something just out of frame. Not because of the art, because of what her price tag is about to be used for. Level 2. The gallery that asks no questions. Pip steps into a sleek gallery downtown, marble floor, white walls, expensive lighting aimed perfectly at every canvas. The gallery owner here has built her reputation over 20 years. Discreet, well-connected. She represents a careful mix of emerging talent and established names. Pip watches a new client walk through the door one afternoon, introduced quietly by a mutual acquaintance, interested in acquiring several pieces, quickly. Pip peeks over the client's shoulder at the paperwork. The payment isn't coming from a person, it's coming from a company. An LLC registered somewhere neither Pip nor the gallery owner has ever heard of, a name that reveals absolutely nothing about who actually controls it. Pip scratches its head. This isn't unusual in the art world, oddly enough. Wealthy collectors have used shell companies for decades, often for entirely normal reasons. Privacy. Tax planning. Avoiding unwanted attention the moment their name gets tied to a major purchase. Pip watches the gallery owner process the sale the same way she processes every other one. Invoice issued to the company. Payment received. Painting shipped. She never learns who the real buyer actually is. She's never required to. Pip floats over to a dusty shelf of old regulatory binders in the back office, flipping one open with tiny hands. For decades, art dealers in most countries operated almost entirely outside the anti-money laundering rules that govern banks and casinos. A bank handling a $100,000 transaction has had to verify identity, flag suspicious patterns, file reports. A gallery handling that exact same amount of money, for a very long stretch of history, often didn't have to do any of that. Pip closes the binder slowly, staring at the cover. That gap is exactly what makes this level of the machine so effective. Nobody here is breaking any rules. For a long stretch of art market history, in many places, there simply weren't equivalent rules to break. The gallery owner isn't a criminal. She's not even particularly careless by the standards of her own industry. Pip watches her lock up the gallery for the night, completely unaware of what she's just been a quiet part of. She's operating inside a system built, for entirely separate historical reasons, with almost no visibility into where the money buying the art actually comes from. That invisibility is about to become extremely useful to somebody several levels above her. Pip follows the newly shipped painting out the back door, toward a waiting truck.
Level 3. The Freeport. The truck doesn't head toward a fancy apartment or a private mansion. Pip watches it drive straight toward a cargo terminal instead. The painting gets loaded onto a plane. Pip squeezes into a tiny gap between crates just to keep watching. Hours later, the plane lands somewhere far away, and the crate rolls into a massive building most people have never even heard of. A Freeport. Pip's eyes widen at the sheer size of the place. Picture an enormous, ultra-secure warehouse, climate-controlled to museum standards, sitting inside a designated customs-free zone right next to a major international airport. Officially, it's described as a transit and storage facility. Pip wanders down a long, quiet hallway lined with unmarked doors. Practically, for a certain kind of buyer, it functions as something much closer to a private vault. Here's the part that makes Freeports so unusually useful. Because the zone is treated as being outside normal customs territory, import taxes aren't triggered as long as the goods never technically leave the zone. Pip stops in front of one particular door, ear pressed against it. A painting can be bought, sold, and resold multiple times, all while the physical object never moves an inch, sitting in a climate-controlled room that almost nobody will ever enter. Pip imagines the layers hidden behind that single door. Each sale can be routed through a different shell company. Each transaction can shift the ownership of a multi-million-dollar asset without a single tax authority necessarily ever seeing it happen, because the asset never crosses a border that would normally trigger that kind of scrutiny. Pip pulls out the magnifying glass and holds it up to a crack in the door. Researchers and journalists who've studied these facilities estimate the value of art and valuables sitting inside major freeports worldwide runs into the tens of billions of dollars. Nobody knows the exact number. That's precisely the point of the whole design. Pip notices the guards patrolling the hallway, biometric scanners glowing at every checkpoint. The buildings themselves are secured almost to the level of a national bank vault. Armed guards, insurance policies that rival small companies. Pip realizes something odd standing there in the hallway. The purpose isn't really protecting the art from theft. The purpose is protecting the transaction from ever being visible at all. Somewhere inside this exact building, Pip finds it. The $42 million painting from the very beginning of this story. Sitting in a private room. Owned by a company, owned by another company, registered somewhere that doesn't require public disclosure of who's really behind it. Pip sits down in front of the painting, alone in the quiet room. Nobody has enjoyed this painting in over 3 years.
It exists purely as a line on a balance sheet almost nobody is ever allowed to see. Pip reaches out and almost touches the frame, then pulls its hand back, remembering it isn't really supposed to be here at all.
Level 4. The auction house and the price that means nothing. Pip climbs back out of the Freeport and finds itself back at an auction house, the same kind of room from the very start of the story. Auction houses occupy a strange position in this whole machine. Unlike a quiet gallery sale, an auction is public, at least on the surface. Pip watches the hammer rise above the podium. A price gets announced. The hammer falls. Everyone in the room and everyone watching the live stream at home sees the number appear. But Pip notices something missing every single time. The identity behind that winning bid is almost never revealed. Bidders register through representatives, through numbered paddles tied to shell entities, through phone bids relayed quietly by an employee speaking to someone whose name appears nowhere in the public record. Pip walks along the row of phone bid employees, watching their lips move, unable to hear a single name. Here's where the whole machine gets almost impressively elegant, in a way that's uncomfortable once you understand it. Art doesn't have an objective value the way a share of stock does. Pip holds up 2 fingers, comparing a stock ticker in one hand to a painting in the other. A share of a public company trades based on visible, comparable data everyone can check. A painting's value is whatever 2 people in a room agree it's worth, in that exact moment, for reasons only they need to understand. Pip's magnifying glass fogs up slightly with realization. That subjectivity is a feature of this machine, not a flaw. If a piece with almost no prior sales history suddenly sells for $18 million, there's no simple way to prove that price is inflated, deflated, or entirely artificial. Pip watches 2 paddles rise in the same room, moments apart. 2 shell companies, both ultimately controlled by the exact same person, can transact through an auction house, moving money from one pocket into another, while generating a completely legitimate, publicly recorded sale price along the way. Pip peers behind the podium and imagines the invisible thread connecting both paddles back to one single hand. The auction house takes its commission either way, regardless of who's really behind the purchase. It has limited incentive, and in many cases limited legal obligation, to dig any deeper into why a relatively unknown piece just made headlines. Journalists have documented cases exactly like this over the years. Works of art bouncing between related buyers at rapidly escalating prices, creating a paper trail that looks, on the surface, like nothing more than a hot piece of art quietly appreciating in value. Pip sits down on the auctioneer's now empty podium once the room clears out. Nobody at the auction house necessarily even knows this is happening in any individual case. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire level of the machine. It doesn't require a conspiracy of insiders. It just requires an industry that was never built to ask hard questions, meeting buyers who are counting on exactly that.
Level 5. The advisor who structures the web. Pip wanders into a quiet, expensive-looking office suite, all glass walls and soft lighting. Above the gallery owner, above the auction house, sits a smaller and far more specialized layer of this entire machine. Art advisors. Wealth managers who specialize specifically in high-value collectibles. Lawyers who structure ownership entities for a living, the way an architect designs a building. Pip sits across from one of these advisors at a large glass desk, completely invisible to them, just watching. These professionals aren't necessarily criminals either, and it's worth being precise here. Most of what they do, most of the time, serves entirely legitimate purposes. Pip nods slowly, trying to keep an open mind. Estate planning? Legal tax minimization? Genuine privacy for high net worth families who don't want their home address effectively published every time they buy a painting. Pip understands that part completely. But the exact same toolkit, built for those legitimate purposes, works identically well for someone trying to obscure the origin of illicit funds. Pip watches the advisor sketch out a diagram on a whiteboard. A skilled advisor can structure a purchase through a whole chain of entities spanning multiple jurisdictions, each one adding another layer of distance between the money's original source and its final destination. Pip traces the diagram with a tiny finger, following each arrow.
Layer 1 might be a shell company in one country. Layer 2, a trust in another. Layer 3, a foundation structure that further obscures who really owns any of it. Pip's eyes widen as the diagram fills the entire whiteboard. By the time the painting is actually purchased, tracing the money back to its true origin would require cooperation across multiple legal systems, multiple sets of banking secrecy laws, multiple corporate registries that were often specifically designed not to reveal who's really behind them. Pip steps back from the whiteboard, overwhelmed by how tidy and legal the whole diagram looks. Investigations by international journalism consortiums over the past decade have repeatedly surfaced cases where individuals under financial sanctions or facing serious corruption allegations were found to have acquired significant art collections through exactly this kind of layered structure. The advisors involved in these cases have often maintained they were simply providing standard wealth management services, unaware of or not legally required to investigate their client's underlying source of funds. Pip shrugs, unsure what to believe, because that uncertainty is often impossible for outsiders to resolve, which is, again, exactly the design. This level of the machine isn't really about hiding a painting anymore. Pip erases the whiteboard slowly with one hand, watching the whole diagram disappear. It's about hiding a person.
Level 6, the regulator, trying to catch up. Pip finds itself in a much plainer office now. Fluorescent lights, stacks of paper folders instead of marble floors. A financial crimes investigator sits at a cluttered desk, staring at a case file that makes almost no sense. Pip hops onto the corner of the desk to read over the investigator's shoulder. A painting purchased for $6 million. Sold 18 months later, through a completely different entity, for $19 million. Pip counts on tiny fingers, trying to make the math make sense. No obvious reason for the increase. No major exhibition. No critical reappraisal of the artist's importance. Just a number that tripled, attached to a buyer whose true identity sits behind at least 3 layers of corporate structure spanning 3 different countries. Pip frowns at the file, genuinely troubled now. For decades, investigators like this one had very few tools available to even begin pulling that thread. Art dealers in most major markets weren't required to file the kind of suspicious activity reports banks have been legally obligated to file for years. Pip watches the investigators sigh and rub their eyes. That started changing meaningfully only in the past several years. Governments in the European Union, the United States, and elsewhere began extending anti-money laundering regulations to cover art transactions above certain thresholds. Pip perks up slightly at this, a small flicker of hope. New rules now require some galleries and auction houses to verify buyer identities and report transactions that look suspicious. The same basic obligations banks have operated under for a long time already. Pip smiles for a moment. It's a real shift. But it's also, according to many of the investigators and researchers who study this space, still full of gaps. Pip's smile fades slightly. Freeports in several jurisdictions remain only lightly regulated. Enforcement varies enormously from country to country. A transaction structured carefully enough, spread across the right combination of jurisdictions, can still move through the system with minimal friction. Pip watches the investigator close the file that afternoon. Not because the case is solved. Because there isn't enough evidence within reach to prove intent. Only a pattern that looks unusual. Pip sits quietly on the edge of the desk. Unusual isn't illegal. Proving illegal, in a system built for centuries around discretion and privacy, remains one of the hardest jobs in modern financial crime enforcement. Pip climbs down off the desk slowly, following the case file as it gets placed back into a drawer. Unresolved. Level 7. The room nobody enters. Pip travels back, one final time, to that same Freeport from earlier. The painting sits exactly where it's been for years, climate-controlled, fully insured, worth more on paper today than it was the day it first arrived. Pip stands in front of it in the empty room, alone with the canvas. Nobody has looked at it in months. Nobody needs to. Pip tilts its head,
staring into the painted scene, wondering if the artist would even recognize her own work anymore. Its value was never really about being seen. It was about existing as a stable, transportable, difficult-to-trace store of value. One that can move across a border inside a crate without triggering the same alarms that moving an equivalent sum of cash would trigger at any airport in the world. Pip sits down cross-legged on the cold floor in front of the painting. Somewhere, on a ledger controlled by a foundation, controlled by a trust, controlled by a person whose name appears on none of the paperwork, that painting represents wealth that entered this system through channels nobody outside a small circle will ever fully understand. Pip thinks back to the very first scene of this whole story. The artist, painting quietly in her small studio above a hardware store. Pip pictures her right now, brush in hand, completely unaware. As far as she knows, her work found a passionate private collector out there somewhere who simply loved it enough to keep it for themselves. Pip lowers its head slightly at that thought. In a strange way, that's the most unsettling part of this entire machine. Nobody at any single level necessarily has to know they're part of something larger. Pip counts each level again on tiny fingers, one by one. The artist just wants to sell her work. The gallery owner just wants to close a sale. The auction house just wants its commission. The advisor just wants to serve a client's stated wishes. Pip looks up at the painting one last time. Each person at each level can look at their own small piece of the transaction and see nothing more than ordinary business. It's only when you step back far enough to see every level at once, from the studio to the vault, that the shape of the entire machine becomes visible. Pip stands slowly, brushing off imaginary dust, taking one final look around the quiet, locked room. A machine built not out of malice at any single point along the chain, but out of an entire industry's century-long comfort with silence. Pip turns and walks toward the door, glancing back one more time. Somewhere behind a locked door, in a building most people will never see, a $42 million painting waits in the dark. Worth everything on paper, and nothing to anyone who might have actually loved it. Pip steps out into the light, closing the door quietly behind them, leaving the painting exactly as it was found. Alone.